A storm is brewing in the agriculture sector.
Trump's tariffs are no fun for farmers like me.
Yeah, in one word, it's uncertainty.
In the farming industry, a storm is coming. As a farmer, I don't like Trump's taxes. Yes, it's doubt in a word. Late last night, contracts were broken. Grain ships got stuck at the docks. 7 of America's closest farming partners left in just 1 year, choosing to buy maize from Canada instead of the U.S. For American farmers, it's not just missed sales. Tables are empty of bread, animals can't get food, and small towns are losing their main source of income. Country after country is leaving the U.S. for Canada's stability, technology, and trust, which are benefits that the U.S. can no longer guarantee. You'll know this isn't just a market change when you see who's on the list. It's a turning point for generations. Egypt comes in at number 7. The base has its first crack. It didn't happen all at once that America lost its economic dominance. It started with 7 planned betrayals that changed the future of food security around the world for good. This is where it all began. It was 3 a.m. when the call came. Time in Cairo. The voice of an Egyptian grain buyer was rough from being so tired. He was canceling the biggest maize deal his country had made in 5 years. It's not because of price or quality, but because of something much more dangerous: not knowing. He said quietly as he hung up, "We can't build our bread supply on shifting sand." What we talked about was the start of the end for American maize in Egypt. Egypt's mills had been relying on regular shipments from Illinois and Iowa for more than 30 years. Everything from animal feed to the flatbread that feeds 104 million Egyptians was made with corn. They trusted each other and knew they could count on America to be reliable in farming, which wasn't something else in the world. Then there were trade wars and changes in strategy. The tweets at midnight that with just 280 characters could change whole markets. Egyptian importers were worried as they saw contracts with other countries break overnight, packages be held up by sudden tariff fights, and long-term deals fall apart in the middle of political chaos. Egyptians in charge of food security started to lose sleep. As they watched their main source of income from farming become a political football, late-night emergency talks became the norm. They got food from all over the world through the Suez Canal, but 67% of their maize came from a single source that became less reliable over time. They began to ask questions that made me feel bad. What if there was a trade disagreement while their grain ships were in the middle of their trip? What if new rules made it illegal for them to move maize? It's possible that Egypt could lose its main source of food without any prior notice if the political winds changed. When a normal package was held up for 2 weeks because of stricter paperwork rules that seemed to be more about politics than food safety, things finally broke. Egyptian bakers started rationing flour, while perfectly good maize sat in American ports being inspected over and over again. The answer came from Canada, which was a surprise. Representatives from Alberta Grain didn't come with flashy displays or pushy sales pitches. Something much more useful, boring, and reliable came with them. There wouldn't be any political drama or policy changes at midnight. There would just be steady, regular maize supply with clear prices and contracts that wouldn't fall apart over a diplomatic row. The Canadian method was revolutionary because it was so easy to understand. 5-year contracts with fixed prices and delivery dates that wouldn't change based on political feelings, documentation that met foreign standards without needing to be re-elucidated all the time, and quality standards that were always the same, could be measured, and were guaranteed. First, the switch happened slowly, then all at once. Canada's first buy from Egypt was a test shipment of 50,000 tons. When the Canadian maize came, its moisture content was just right for their machines. It went more smoothly, less trash was made. Because the raw materials were so constant, production efficiency went up by 12%. Within 18 months, Egypt signed a deal with Canadian suppliers that would last for 5 years and pay $847 million a year. The contract had backup shipping routes through multiple ports, plans for emergency deliveries when supplies were cut off, and quality guarantees that meant something. People who exported maize from the United States didn't even know they were being replaced until the orders stopped coming in. There were no returns on the calls. Talks about renewing the contract were put off indefinitely. After 30 years together, the couple broke up without arguing, but in silence. These days, only Canadian maize is processed in Egyptian mills. Wheat fields in Saskatchewan grow the bread that Cairo eats. Animals that are sold in Egyptian markets are fed feed from Manitoba. And American farmers who used to depend on contracts with Egypt are now sitting there with their phones off while their food rots in storage silos. Egypt had a clear message, even if they never said it out loud. We need to be sure we have enough food, not play about politics. When Egypt left, it sent shockwaves through world markets, but what happened next showed that America's agricultural power was weaker than anyone thought. Sixth, South Korea, the quiet change of the tech giant. Importers of grains in Seoul have always been proud of how efficiently they work. South Korea is a country where technology is changing every business. Food processors there expected their agricultural suppliers to keep up, tracking in real time, proof through the blockchain, and digital documents that could be checked right away from a smartphone. Smart, connected, and clear food. Supply lines were thought to be the way of the future. American businesses that sell maize were still running like it was 1995. Things finally broke down during a regular check at Busan port. For 3 weeks, a package of American maize sat while officials tried to confirm where it came from. The paperwork was spread out in a lot of different platforms. Some papers were made by hand. Others needed to be contacted by phone to confirm their identity. The tracking method stopped being updated as soon as the grain left the United States. Korean food makers were angry that their production line was being held up while inspectors played detective with incomplete paperwork. The corn was good, but to prove it, an archaeological dig through paper tracks that belonged in a museum was needed. On the other hand, a shipment from Canada that came the same day was processed and sent out within 48 hours. It was possible to find the exact field where each seed was grown. The digital records were available right away, could be checked, and were full. They could see in real time how the grains got from the land in Canada to the processing plants in South Korea. The difference in productivity was huge. South Korean food companies bought more than just maize. They bought confidence in the supply chain. American agricultural exports had slowed things down in a market where just-in-time delivery is very important. It was too expensive for Korean factories to leave their production lines idle while shipments of grain slipped into bureaucratic black holes. Complete openness was something new that Canadian suppliers offered. Every step of the farming process was written down, checked, and made available through safe online platforms. From their office computers, Korean buyers could check on farming methods, look at quality control measures, and keep an eye on packages in real time. The technology fit together perfectly. When the Canadian grain came, it had QR codes that led to huge databases that showed everything from the state of the soil to when blockchain-based tools that made compliance easy were already in place for Canadian suppliers. American exporters were still working out how to keep their records digitally. Korean customers started to want to know more about where their food came from. They were interested in where the products came from, how they were grown, and how they were processed. Canadian suppliers could give that information right away through platforms that customers could view. Even industrial buyers in the US couldn't get it from American suppliers. Within 2 years, South Korea had changed its whole maize supply chain to depend on relationships with Canada. The performance gains happened right away. 34% shorter working times, 67% fewer delays caused by paperwork, and no disruptions to the supply chain. Korean food companies could focus on coming up with new ideas instead of managing their processes. The relationship was more than just trading goods. Korean tech companies started working with Canadian farming companies to make the next generation of farming tools. As Canada and South Korea built up their supply lines to work together, South Korea invested 34% more in Canadian agricultural technology. American maize exporters couldn't do anything as one of their most reliable buyers left. Not because of politics or trade conflicts, but because technology stops working as well as it used to. Being dependable wasn't enough in the digital age. You had to be smart, honest, and linked. South Korea picked the future, and that future spoke Canadian. But Southeast Asia's supply chain change was much more important than South Korea's high level of technological precision. Number 5, Vietnam, the turn that made everything different. The text message was only 12 words long, but it changed the whole grain trade in Southeast Asia. Starting right away, we are switching to Canadian providers. Thanks for everything. With that message, Vietnam's biggest feed maker broke off a business relationship with an American maize provider that had been going on for more than 20 years. There were no talks, warnings, or second chances. There was only a quiet turn that would change the way trade and agriculture works all along the Pacific Rim. Vietnam did not make its choice in an office. It was made in the Mekong Delta, in rice fields and fish farms. Millions of farmers were sick of seeing their prices change based on how the U.S. government felt about politics. Farmers in Vietnam were hurt every time there was trouble between Washington and Beijing. During trade fights, maize prices went through the roof. When diplomatic ties got worse, shipments were held up. It became hard to guess what feed costs would be because they were linked to big political events instead of basic farming skills. Vietnamese seafood businesses that grow prawns and fish for sale around the world were losing a lot of money because prices were going up and down all the time. When feed prices changed every week, farmers couldn't plan breeding rounds because they couldn't know how much their inputs would cost 6 months in advance. Fish farm owners couldn't sign foreign contracts. When American trade practices started to hurt Vietnamese exports to other countries, the crisis got worse. Seafood producers in Vietnam had their goods caught up in trade issues that had nothing to do with Vietnam. Vietnam's whole economy was affected by the political costs that came with American agricultural products that were not obvious. Vietnamese farming officials looked at all of their supply chain weaknesses in great detail. The results were really shocking. 78 of the foods they bought came from the United States or went through facilities controlled by the unit, Ed states. One political choice in Washington, D.C. could make it hard for 97 million people to get food. For a country that was trying to become food security independent, that level of risk was... The price of maize in Canada was set by basic agricultural factors, not by diplomatic conflicts. Vietnamese buyers could plan their businesses years ahead of time because Canadian suppliers really kept prices stable. Small sales were the first ones to switch. Vietnamese buyers checked out the quality of Canadian maize, how often it was delivered, and how stable the prices were. They were amazed by what they found. The corn was the same quality, and it didn't have any political ties, which was something American producers couldn't do. Canada and China were not in a trade war. Canada's policies on farming didn't change when elections came up. Canadian exporters could offer fixed-price contracts that last for 5 years and wouldn't change because of political unrest. For the first time in years, Vietnamese buyers could base their business plans on stable prices. The reliability change wasn't just limited to maize. Vietnamese fish farmers learned that Canadian suppliers could offer complete feed options that were made to fit aquaculture operations. Because the grain was processed to exact specs for fish nutrition, the fish grew faster and had a higher chance of survival. Vietnamese farming cooperatives started to change their whole supply lines to focus on partnerships with Canada. Because they knew what would happen, they were able to grow their business, buy better equipment, and feel confident about signing foreign contracts. Within the first year, agricultural output went up by 23% because farmers could focus on growing crops instead of managing the supply line. It changed quickly and completely. In 2022, 78% of Vietnam's maize imports came from the United States. By 2025, 89% of them came from Canada. As other Southeast Asian countries watched Vietnam become less dependent on American politics for its agriculture, the reliability revolution spread across the region. The effects spread to every part of Vietnamese economy. Farmers who raise pigs could plan breeding rounds without having to worry about how feed prices would change. Fish farms could be sure of their prices when they signed foreign contracts. Rural cooperatives could invest in growth because they knew their costs of goods and labor wouldn't change with the American election cycle. The relationship was more than just trading goods. Canadian companies that work with agricultural technology started to set up study centers in Vietnam. Joint development projects focused on aquaculture in tropical areas, environmentally friendly farming methods, and grain types that can grow in different climates. Vietnamese students were given grants to study agricultural science at universities in Canada. When Vietnam defected, it sent shockwaves through food markets around the world. Still, American producers had no idea what was going to happen in the world's most strategically important area. Fourth, Saudi Arabia, the Desert Kingdom's new plan for the future. In the shiny Ministry of Agriculture building in Riyadh, a choice was made that would shake up grain markets around the world. Saudi Arabia, which gets 85% of its food from other countries, was changing the way its whole farming supply chain works. The United States wasn't asked to take part for the first time in 40 years. The kingdom's simple plan for food security has always been to get food from a variety of countries so that it doesn't have to rely on just one. But when they looked at their import data, a trend that worried them became clear. Even though they had suppliers from many countries, almost everything still went through trade routes and systems that were controlled and affected by the United States. It became clear to Saudi leaders that their idea of diversification was not real. The wake-up call came at a time when American trade policy was very unstable. 3 times in 18 months, political issues that had nothing to do with agriculture could have Each time, the food supply of the kingdom was used as a bargaining chip in a disagreement that had nothing to do with farming. Saudi officials in charge of food security used war games to see how strong their supply chains were. The results were very scary. In just a few weeks, a single American policy choice could lead to food shortages. The kingdom that controlled the world's oil markets was very sensitive to food politics in other countries. When a normal supply of grain was held up for 10 days, while American officials did extra security checks, things finally broke down. That looked like it was made more for political purposes than for real safety. Saudi strategic planners saw their food supplies get damaged in politics that had nothing to do with them. That's when Saudi planners began to look north. Canada gave Saudi Arabia a new way to make sure they had enough food they could trade without using American infrastructure. It was a truly independent supply line that could work even when there were diplomatic problems in other parts of the world. Canadian grain didn't go through American ports, American banks, or American political considerations. The first agricultural agreement between Saudi Arabia and Canada was signed in secret without any public attention. It was a 5-year deal for 400,000 tons of Canadian corn, wheat, and canola each year. The terms were clear. There were no political interference clauses, set prices, and guaranteed delivery. What happened next even shocked the Saudis who planned it. Not only was the Canadian supply system separate, it was also better. When Canadian grain arrived, it came with digital paperwork that could be checked right away. From the farm to the port, the blockchain tracking tools made everything clear. Before the goods even left Canada, Saudi inspectors could check their quality, where titish, hay came from, and how they were handled. The level of technological sophistication was higher than what they had seen from American sources. Even more importantly, Canadian producers knew what Saudi Arabia needed. When the grain arrived, it was already cleaned to the exact standards needed for keeping in the desert. The packaging was made to survive changes in temperature and humidity. Documentation was made according to Saudi import rules, and it didn't need to be clarified or redone over and over again. Canadian agricultural officials worked closely with Saudi officials in charge of food security to make sure that supply chains were as reliable and efficient as possible. They set up extra shipping routes, backup storage sites, and rules for emergency deliveries. The relationship was more than just business. The United States had been nice to Saudi Arabia and treated them like any other customer. Their Canadian suppliers saw them as a key partner whose food security was important to the whole country. When Canadian companies that make agricultural technology started setting up shop in Saudi Arabia, the bond got stronger. The joint ventures were mainly about farming in deserts, farming that uses little water, and long-term food supply. Advanced irrigation systems, climate-controlled storage facilities, and precision farming methods were some of the technologies that were transferred. It only took 3 years for Saudi Arabia's agricultural products to change completely. 67 of the kingdom's grain imports now come from Canadian sources. A big part of Saudi Arabia's plan to make sure there is enough food is that their farms are reliable, produce good food, and are not controlled by the government. The relationship was more than just trading goods. Saudi Arabia put $2.3 billion into building up Canada's farming infrastructure, such as ports, grains, processing plants, and research centers. The kingdom was making long-term agreements with farmers that couldn't be broken by changes in politics. The change made the Middle East Other countries started to study and copy the kingdom's success with Canadian agriculture as a model for food security in the area. It was terrible to lose Saudi Arabia, but American farming could go on without the Middle East. What came next, though, would destroy America's farming kingdom from the inside out. Third, Mexico, the betrayal of a neighbor. Because it came from next door, the deception hurt the most. Mexico had been the most steady customer for American farmers for more than 70 years. Grain trade across borders was so common that it didn't even come up in diplomatic talks. American corn was the main ingredient in the supply lines of tortilla factories, farms that raise animals, and food processors in Mexico. It wasn't just business, it was family. But trust is important in family ties, and it's hard to rebuild trust once it's been broken. Uncertainty about policy caused the split to start. Mexican food companies were worried as they saw how American trade strategy changed with each election. It didn't take long for NAFTA to turn into USMCA. Threats of tariffs came and went because of disagreements about immigrants that had nothing to do with farming. Normally transporting crops became a political football in talks that had nothing to do with the shipments. Buyers from Mexico were stuck in a situation where the rules could change at any time. Contracts that looked safe were open to political gamesmanship. Trade deals that had been working well for decades had to be constantly renegotiated because of disagreements about industry, immigration, or border policies. When a normal supply of maize was held up for 3 weeks because of stricter inspection rules that seemed more about politics than food safety, That was the breaking point. There weren't enough raw materials for Mexican tortilla makers, which was very bad, WH. While their corn sat in sheds on the American border being inspected over and over again. Officials in charge of food security in Mexico were horrified to see their main source of food become a negotiating chip in the immigration process. Making tortillas slowed down, animal feed stores ran out. While perfectly good maize sat still because of political posturing, food makers started putting emergency rationing plans into place. The damage to the economy was instant and very bad. Due to delays in production, Mexican food companies lost $340 million over the course of 3 weeks. Prices for tortillas went through the roof in Mexico because supply lines were having a hard time with fake shortages. Mexican customers had to pay for American politics on the big screen. After that, Mexican buyers began to ask risky questions. What would happen in a real diplomatic crisis if the U.S. could stop food supplies over political problems that had nothing to do with each other? How could Mexico make sure that 130 million people have enough food if regular maize supplies could be used as political weapons? Canada gave the answer in the form of a plan that almost seemed too good to be true. Canadian providers gave Mexico something that had never been done before. There were no political issues involved in agricultural trade at all. Grain exports would go on as usual no matter what happened in the diplomatic world between Ottawa and Mexico City. There will be no more reviews, changes to policies, or political theater. 10,000 tons of corn were sent through ports on the Pacific coast as part of the first agricultural pilot scheme between Mexico and Canada. But the results were very different. The Canadian grain arrived right on time, and with all the right paperwork, the quality was better than expected, and most importantly, there were no political issues. Mexican food companies found that getting their supplies from Canada had benefits beyond just being politically stable. The grain was of higher quality and arrived with the right amount. Canadian producers looked into what Mexican manufacturers needed and changed how they did things to meet those needs. The change from North America's closest farming neighbor shook the whole grain trade in North America. If Mexico could find more reliable suppliers elsewhere, every other American farm buyer began to wonder how weak their own supply chains were. American farmers lost more than just their biggest market for exports. Their closest neighbor stopped trusting them. In farming, trust spreads faster than grain shipping. Second, Japan is the right partner for the precision economy. Grain importers in Tokyo's financial area stared at computer screens that showed something that had never been seen before. It was the first time in 60 years that Japan's maize imports from the U.S. were less than 50% of the total amount. It wasn't a slow fall. The controlled explosion was done with the accuracy that Japan was known for in its manufacturing. The change started in quality control labs, where Japanese food companies found something strange about exports of American grains. Consistency was getting worse. The amount of moisture in each package was different. Protein amounts changed without warning. For an economy based on precise manufacturing, the United States' agricultural products had become too unstable. Japanese companies that make food needed maize that always met their exact needs. Even a 2% difference in moisture content could stop production lines, cause shipments to be late, and hurt relationships with foreign customers who expected Japanese-level quality control. That sort of consistency couldn't come from American suppliers. Suppliers from Canada could. The change started when Mitsubishi's agricultural division put Canadian maize to the test in their toughest use as top feed for raising Wagyu beef. The standards were very strict. The amount of protein had to be within 0.5% of what was required. Levels of moisture couldn't change by more than 1% from one package to the next. It was okay to have no contamination. Not only did Canadian grain meet these requirements, it went above and beyond them. Each shipment came with a thorough analysis report that showed the exact amounts of nutrients in each item. Advanced drying technology was used to exactly control the amount of moisture. At several points in the supply chain, the protein level was checked and confirmed. It was amazing how consistent it was. That being said, quality was only the start. Japanese imports of grain were changed by something that Canadian sources offered: easy delivery prediction. With the help of cutting-edge logistics technology, Canadian producers could guess when goods would arrive within hours, not days. Japanese producers were able to make production schedules that were more accurate than ever before. Japanese efficiency is based on just-in-time manufacturing, which was made possible for farming inputs. It was a great fit for the culture. Japanese companies expected their providers to pay attention to detail, check quality, and provide good customer service. Canadian agricultural businesses did all of these things. The meetings began on time. Promises were kept exactly as promised. Problems with quality were fixed right away. On the other hand, American suppliers often seemed unconcerned about differences in quality, shipping delays, and how they talked to customers. The Japanese didn't like the kinds of business methods that they thought were okay for farming. When Japanese officials put in place new traceability rules for imported food ingredients, the change happened faster. Blockchain-based tracking tools were already in place for Canadian suppliers, which made compliance easy. American suppliers had a hard time giving Japan the thorough paperwork that their rules needed. Within 4 years, Canadian sellers got 67% of the maize that Japan bought. The Relati agreements to share technology made farming more efficient in both countries. Japan's biggest food company announced a 10-year exclusive relationship with Canadian grain cooperatives, which marked the end of the change. Plans for shared logistics infrastructure, joint research centers, and coordinated marketing in third-country markets were part of the announcement. American grain exporters were shut out of a market that was one of their most profitable and stable. Japan had not only found a new provider, but also a better company to do business with. The precision economy picked precision farming as its leader, and Canada was that leader. First is China, which is the geopolitical pivot for the superpowers. The meeting took place in a plain office block in Beijing, but what happened there would change agriculture around the world forever. The Agricultural Development Committee of China was looking over their food security plan when they came to an unexpected result. Even though they bought grain from many countries, American politics made their food supply very insecure. One change in Washington could make it hard for 1.4 billion people to get food. For a growing superpower, that weakness was not acceptable. To find an answer, people had to think outside of normal business relationships. China needed agricultural partners that could give them a lot of food, constant quality, and no political ties to the United States. It was their search that took them to Canada's huge grain fields and a chance that would make everything different. China's first order of grain from Canada was a big deal. Over the course of 18 months, 2.3 million tons of corn, wheat, and oats were sent. But this wasn't just swapping goods. It was the start of a smart partnership in farming. China got something new from Canadian suppliers, the power to bypass America and controlled trade infrastructure entirely. It is possible for Canadian grain to be shipped through the Arctic, processed in Canadian facilities, and delivered without going through American ports, banks, or political processes. What that meant was shocking. For the first time since World War II, China could make sure it had enough food without relying on American agricultural products. It had huge military value. China's food supply would no longer be at risk from trade fights, sanctions, or changes in American politics. But the partnership had benefits that went beyond being free from government interference. Canada's farming technology was getting better very quickly. Precision farming, genetic study, and environmentally friendly ways of growing were consistently getting higher yields than the old American ways. Chinese researchers in agriculture started working together with Canadian study groups. Joint development projects focused on crop types that do well in cold weather, irrigation systems that work well, and farming methods that are good for the environment. The sharing of technology sped up the development of new farming methods in both countries. The size of the partnership grew by a huge amount. China and Canada's second agricultural agreement covered 5.7 million tons every year. The third deal included sharing technologies, setting up joint study centers, and working together to create new trade routes through the Arctic. American companies that sell grains abroad were shocked when their biggest customer set up a totally separate supply chain. Over 3 years, China bought 78% less American maize than it did 3 years before. 84% less wheat was sent abroad. Soybean shipments, which used to be a big part of American agriculture exports, have almost stopped. The effects on world politics were huge. China was no longer dependent on American sources for its agriculture, and its relationship with Canada was also getting stronger. The long-term strategic balance of global food security had changed, but China's push facet